Hello and welcome to a revision video. In this video we're going to be looking at whether or not Albert Speer was responsible for saving the war economy of Germany. And for the purposes of this video we're going to argue that he probably was the most responsible for saving Germany's war economy. So starting by looking at Speer, whilst it's true that Goering's 4-year plan was in place at the beginning of the war, as he'd been in charge of it since 1936. Ultimately, the 4-year plan didn't go far enough to achieve autarky, and a good statistic to back this up would be that, for example, they ran out of ammunition only 6 weeks into the war. So the 4-year plan hadn't gone far enough, and therefore Speer was really a saviour of the war economy. His switch to factories being running on a 24-hour 3-shift pattern per day, and including conscripted workers to places that most needed them for work, caused a general 60% increase in production, and most impressively they were able to increase aircraft production by 200% 1942 to 44 using this method, and tank production 250% in the same time period using this 24-hour factory and conscripted worker approach. And in that way Speer was responsible for saving Germany's war economy, because without the production of aircraft and tank ammunitions in a more successful way than under the previous 4-year plan from Goering, they wouldn't have been able to sustain their fight against the Allies for so long. So in that way Albert Speer was responsible for saving Germany's war economy. The second most important cause of Germany's war economy being sustained or saved in this period is probably the use of forced labour. So this could be worded in a few different ways possibly in your exam. So they might refer to whether military successes were the cause of Germany being able to sustain its war economy, or perhaps they might specifically mention Sokol, who was in charge of forced labour, or even forced labour itself. But when they're talking about forced labour, what they're really talking about is prisoners of war. And we know that in particular after the invasion of the USSR in 1941, or Russia if you'd rather call it Russia, there was an increased use of prisoners of war, and in fact around October, November 1941, Hitler decreed that prisoners of war could be used as slave labour. So from 1941 onwards we see a massive increase in the use of forced labour. Sokol was in charge of transporting prisoners of war to camps, and we know that in total by 1944 around 14 million were being used, and that made up around 25% of Germany's workforce by 1944. Obviously, they were not as effective and productive as patriotic German workers who'd chosen to work for the German war effort. However, it's a substantial number of people that made up the overall workforce, and so it was required to help save Germany's war economy, but probably not as important and responsible for saving the war economy as Speer's changing of the factory system and use of German workers there. And finally, probably the least significant but still played a role in saving Germany's war economy was the use of propaganda to mobilise labour in Germany. So, for example, we know that after the losses at Stalingrad in around sort of early 1943, Goebbels made the total war speech, and he called on ordinary people to to support the war effort. We also know that the head of the DAF, the German Labour Front, Robert Ley, in 1943 similarly was publishing pamphlets to encourage women into the workforce, as they hadn't been particularly successful in increasing the number of women in the workforce, despite the fact that technically they were conscripting women into the National Labour Service from 1939. So we know that propaganda in itself wasn't hugely successful in increasing numbers in the workforce, because if it had been, then conscription wouldn't have been as necessary. So the fact that they're having to conscript into the National Labour Service and close small businesses and non-essential trades to get people to transfer into war work suggests that they're having to force people into making those decisions about becoming involved in the German labour effort during the war, rather than people choosing to do so. So perhaps it's not really propaganda that's so important in helping them to save Germany's war economy. Really, it's actions by people like Speer, people in the government, who end up conscripting around 1.75 million Germans into to factories to produce munitions and goods to help save Germany, or at least sustain Germany's war efforts during World War II. So for the purposes of this question, to what extent was Albert Speer responsible for saving the war economy of Germany? We could say to a great extent he was responsible, despite the fact that other people like Goering played a role in making Germany war ready. Ultimately, Speer's approach transformed the success of the factories and things. And even when they were being bombed by the Allies and by the USA, it only decreased production of things like aircraft and tanks by about a third. So they were relatively successful in sustaining their war efforts as a result of his approach. The use of prisoners of war was important, but not as important, because it was about how they were being managed, and Speer was effectively managing those factories. And propaganda, like we've mentioned, was far less important, since they were clearly having to force people into certain types of work. So propaganda was not as successful. I hope this has been useful. Good luck with your revision.